Well, this is a wonderful way to finish the conference, isn't it? We've got some of our wonderful speakers here. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
And I wanted to have a little chat at the end of the this wonderful event, really, and all these wonderful speakers, just to talk a bit more about emotional well-being and the relevancy across species, including for ourselves. And I know, Robert, that's something that you're very interested in, looking at how a lot of this thing interacts with everybody, regardless of species, and looking at that science of happiness.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Um, I actually came into behavior from veterinary medicine. So I'd done veterinary medicine for decades. That's clinical medicine, very evidence-based. And when I started drifting over into behavior and started reading the literature in the psychology domain, one of the things that really struck me was how learning theory, the idea of classical and operant conditioning, etc., didn't really fit what I was seeing, because it was all around looking at behavior. The whole thing was about behavior, 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 and nothing else mattered. And of course, this was in the early 2000s. So 1999, early 2000s, that's when I started looking at this. And at that time, there was quite a movement, particularly in TV shows and that kind of thing, with upcoming behaviorists. And the whole idea of dog behavior was coming into the domain. So it was a natural point for me to step into the behavior side of things. I had a kind of ready crop of clients because there were people coming in with their dogs with urinary tract problems and all that kind of thing. And of course, they were having behavioral problems at home as well. And that's what really got me thinking about this. So, um, to cut the long story short, the thing I learned very early on is that the focus really was not on behavior. It must be something beyond that. That is what the animals are feeling. So this is where the emotionality thing comes in. So that's where I actually entered the behavior field, thinking about emotionality rather than behavior. And it's more kind of recently that I started to look at how we can describe these things to, firstly, other behaviorists and trainers, but also for the end users, which of course are the owners that have those pets as their responsibility. Because one of the things I really struggled with over the 10, 15 years of behavior is that um, we were all talking about the right things and the importance of emotions and that sort of thing. But when it came to translating that into something the caregivers or owners could actually implement practically, there seemed to be a gap there. And I've spent most of my time in behavior actually teaching. And it's through what I've done in the teaching domain where it really got me thinking about the kind of language we're using for describing emotionality in animals. And one of the things that struck me when I started thinking about this literature is that if you look at the human domain, which I went back to that because particularly after the pandemic, there's an awful lot of talk and focus on mental health coming out of the pandemic and mental well-being and all this sort of thing. And if you go and read the literature for humans, the focus is entirely on well-being and happiness. The only time that welfare is mentioned, which really surprised me, was in the context of describing people who were really kind of at the bottom of the heap, if you like. People who were really on the breadline, they were on benefits. There were people who were considered in poverty. They were in third world countries, perhaps. And for those people, we put the label of welfare on them. But for everybody else, just for how things ought to be in the normal, we talked about well-being and happiness. And so that's why in the first part of my talk, I focused very much on how we frame and how we measure and how we try to objectively define what happiness and well-being is in people, because I thought that was a really good starting point. And then when I went to the literature to try and find the same thing in other species, and the species I looked at specifically were the domestic animals, farm animals, because that's really where we started thinking scientifically about welfare and well-being. Obviously, because it's important, it's part of the legislation. That's where the five freedoms and all these sort of things came from. If we kind of wind the clock right back to when Darwin was talking, the Victorians, they were very liberal in their language. and they were very happy to speak about animals sharing the same kind of emotional lives as we do. And of course, Darwin did that in his book Emotions of Animals and the Emotions of Animals and Other whatever it was called, that second book he wrote. So the thing is that as people, as a group of professionals, and also as a group of dog owners or dog guardians within this conference who have watched all this stuff, are concerned, the thing where we seem to be able to talk very well, we understand the language, but we don't really recognize the difference between welfare and well-being and happiness. We tend to equate the two things at the same thing. So that's why I spend the rest of my talk talking about. I started off with talking about humans, and that's why I spent so much time on that. So some of you found that quite irrelevant who watched that. It is actually really relevant. And then my second part, that's why I then went on to welfare and how we've been measuring it in farm animals. And my argument there was we've actually been getting it all wrong. And there's been very few people in the welfare industries, these people who are academics, they're the ones that do the science, and they write the legislation for welfare, which is where we got the five freedoms from, and then the five domains, etc., etc., etc. And the fact is they've got it all wrong. And what it then brought me to is a book that was written 20 odd years ago, which is a brilliant book. And I go into some detail, a little bit of detail about that in my talk. So I hope when you go back and review this stuff, that you look at that very carefully, because what it does is give us the language that I was looking for. So this is such a relevant book. And then what I do, having moved through that, in the third part of my talk, I then go into how we can put this into some kind of practical implementation. So that was my kind of route through my talk, which I think does make a good introduction and grounding to what the rest of you guys and ladies then went on to talk about through the rest of the conference. So that's about what I did in a nutshell, Andy.
Yeah, and I think this is something I'd like to throw open to everybody actually, because welfare is very much in the eye of the beholder, right? And I think often it's done on purely observational outputs without thinking about the individual's well-being and happiness. Part of that is, and as you say, going back, if we go back long enough, there seemed to be more openness to discussing emotions and animals. Something seemed to happen at the latter part of the last century, especially from probably the 40s, 50s onwards for a period of time, that seemed to move us away from this. And I know when you were starting on your kind of adventures, Robert, you were getting there was some friction there with some of your colleagues about going and thinking about emotions. Anybody else want to come in on that, just to think about why they think we might have had that challenge to think about emotional well-being to be applicable for animals up until what's happening now within the current areas of behavioral science?
Well, I mean,
I,
in the UK, I think there's aspects of it being such a big part of the culture, isn't it? And legally, of course, animals not being recognized as sentient or being able to feel pain for a very long time. And I'm not even sure where we are with a lot of that now. So I would think there's a big part of it that's come from our culture. And then I think there's also pervasiveness of different sciences and different scientific viewpoints. And I think behaviorists have been particularly successful in terms of, I think, perhaps dominating some of the conversation sometimes in the animal field of things. And if you look at behaviorism, it doesn't necessarily even say that emotions don't exist or emotional well-being isn't important, but it sort of if you look at sort of Skinner's work, it's kind of about looking at what is tangible and what can be seen in terms of behavior. So it doesn't really set people up for kind of coming in with that viewpoint of looking at emotions and trying to actually understand why this might be important to understand an animal's emotion. I think, the example that comes up a lot with this is there's so many things in science that we can't necessarily see or can't necessarily physically, tangibly demonstrate exist. But that doesn't mean that they're not important and not things that we should be thinking about and discussing.
That's a really good point because I share a lot the Candace Pert quote about the science will often not really accept things that can't be measured and classes them as non-things, but for the individual, those non-things are often everything. And I think that's what we're trying to be better at finding out from these wonderful animals that we share our lives with. And that's why I think this conference is so good to look at all different species. Sarah, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, I remember having been in this wonderful industry for nearly 30 years, being asked to speak alongside many amazing speakers, and very grateful for all those opportunities. But some behaviorists having to almost apologize by saying, I have to tell you, because it's never been proven, that your dog doesn't love you. But I also have to say, of course, you know that's not true. So for me, historically, there was a very strong thread of only share what has already been proven to exist. And of course, anyway, even if you could prove something existed, then it's all open to interpretation anyway. But also within that, and that does come back to the, not acknowledging the depth of emotion and certainly not seeing the emotional side of pain. But the way animals were supported in terms of pain was also woefully inadequate. And people historically, if you talk to them now, would saying we weren't treating animals appropriately, even within the veterinary profession. And people will share it haunts them still. And certainly that's true for horses. It was always, oh, there's nothing wrong. We've x-rayed that leg. It's in their head. And I remember having many conversations with caregivers saying, if it's in their head, it's in their body too. And we just have to find that. And I think there were people that really started to break ground early on. And the more voices that come and say, this is what we're seeing, but this is also what we're experiencing. And if we're able to experience that, then these glorious animals have to be on that same path and experience that range of emotions that we do too. We know that now. And I think people are becoming more honest and also braver.
Yeah.
And I think conferences like this just bring even more people together and give people permission to speak like that.
And I think that's important, isn't it? The permission bit, and also to kind of have safe spaces to allow ourselves to, whilst recognizing how important it is to stay in the objective, but to be able to talk about the anecdotal and the subjective, and to ask different questions. I think that's very important. Kate.
Yeah, just picking up on what Sarah was saying there about having permission, really. And I find this an awful lot with what I do in the horse world, is that there is still a trend to not recognize emotionality in horses, for sure. But there are pockets of people who actually do, but don't dare to speak out, to advocate, to alter their practices because of basically peer pressure. And certainly situations like livery yards, there's a lot of bullying that still goes on. And if you're prepared to say, well, actually, I'm not going to do this because my horse doesn't like it, or because we're going to do something a bit more enriching, or that type of thing that we all know is very important. The backlash from that can be really quite nasty, and then you're ostracized, and sometimes there's not a lot of choice of where to have your horse, so you're a bit limited. And I think that is a crying shame. And I think I might have said to you before, Andy, or somebody recently, that I've been to clients and they've been whispering to me about what they're feeling about how their horses are experiencing things, because they don't want the person in the next stable to hear it. And I just find that to be so sad, but it's still a thing.
I've worked with so many clients in the past who, when we've discussed things in a more freer way, and just try to give an opportunity for their dog to share something of their own story, they've felt it before, but they've worked with other professionals who've shut that thought process down, those own connections. And I think it's a very delicate act, isn't it? Because you have those who think they know about those animals, and then you have those who really want to be, well, where's the science on that? Where's the science on that? And I think the actual animal's lived experience can fall between those two sometimes. Laura.
Yeah, I do think it's important to put this in kind of a larger perspective, the whole question of, emotionality, well-being, because so much of 30s and 1930s and 40s behaviorism, at least here in North America, was a turn away from all that focus on the unconscious that came with Jung and Freud and people doing research in that area. And you got, and Daniel referred to this, the behaviorist privileging of visible behaviors. So I have to see it for it to be real, meaning I have to see it with my eyes. And then here in North America, and it may have been replicated elsewhere, but you also had the input of very strong emphasis on social conformity. And that's where compliance-based dog training came in, complementary to compliance-based child rearing. The well-behaved child, the well-behaved pet. And of course, that had nothing to do with what the child or the dog, cat, horse wanted. It was all about, my agenda. And usually that did mean children, animals were seen and not heard. They didn't move, they didn't talk, they certainly didn't disrupt my life. And so I think it's important to remember that it hasn't been that long since we even recognize that dogs, for example, experience trauma. What did it take for trauma in dogs to actually be recognized by someone? It was military dogs coming back from Afghanistan, because that's when the VA here in the US started taking trauma seriously in humans. That's when the whole post-traumatic stress syndrome began being publicized and talked about. And then they noticed, oh, isn't it interesting? Dogs seem to be going through the same thing. Bomb sniffing dogs, dogs who had been in combat. And that was what, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So really, we're talking about a fairly recent development in terms of recognizing how deep that emotionality and emphasis on well-being goes.
Yeah, and there almost seems to be that friction between being well behaved, as you call it, from a societal function point of view, and well-being. And I think that's a friction that we see, like as you say, in our wider society. And even that's we could potentially say that's a very kind of modern, very Western organized thing, because we struggle in our own societies to recognize stress and discomfort in our fellow humans a lot of the time, because of the restraints that are put on us because of the societal pressures. Do you think, Robert, that a couple of questions really, I suppose. First is, do you think we've kind of weaponized science a little bit within the animal communities when it comes to thinking about individual animals' needs and well-being? And secondly, why do you think it is that kind of behavioral science has struggled with the emotional needs of the individual previously?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, basically, it's academia that are at the heart of the problem, the whole academic process. And as several of you said already, it goes right back to the post-Victorian age, where everyone was very liberal about animals having emotions. And then we got into the early 20th century, 1912, that sort of time. We had good old John Watson and his behaviorist movement. And then from him, he was the one that wrote this long paper and did this long speech about getting rid of all this fluffy stuff about emotions, and the only thing that matters is what we can see: behavior, behavior, behavior. And remember, he's the guy that did that experiment on little Albert, who was that little child, and traumatized him with this bell and animals and this sort of thing, and made him frightened of everything. Probably gave him PTSD, Laura. When he grew up. And then, of course, we had Skinner in the 1930s. And since then, the way that science has worked, and interestingly enough, if you look at some of the early work on dogs were considered as some sort of degraded subspecies. They weren't considered good for study. And so people didn't study them because we're in the era of ethologists. But that aside, in order to get until fairly recently, i.e. the last 20 years, probably 15 years actually, because when I came into behavior, you would never see the word emotion or feeling in a science paper looking at animals. And the reason for that is basically because you wouldn't get published. If you had a peer-reviewed journal, the peers basically would say you can't use that and you can't use those words. And so for the first half of my career as a behaviorist, I never saw the words emotion or feeling addressing animals as the subject. It was always emotion like or feeling like, which you still read in a lot of papers, PTSD like, anxiety like. And it's only relatively recently that scientists have been literally allowed, to start using that kind of language, the language of emotionality in scientific research. So there's a lot to blame here, Andy. It's not just one thing. Obviously, there's this movement within the behavior circles itself, particularly companion animal behavior with the ABA movement, the importance of trying to go back to Skinner, the importance of what you see, not what you think. But and of course, we've got all these mishmash of different ideas and different thinking that's come along with social media. But yes, the whole thing is a mess. And as I said when I opened the talk, the whole idea that the idea of using well-being and happiness in our welfare legislation and our welfare research on farm animals is still the denial that you mustn't use these words. It all has to be measured. You've got to be able to assess it in some kind of way. So yes, the whole thing's a mess, and it's people like us who are pioneering moving forwards and using words like force-free and trauma and feelings, and we're considered now fluffy people by a lot of people in the behavior industry. So we've all been caught up in this trap, I'm afraid, and the more experienced members, such as Sarah and Laura, I'm the kind of same vintage. We know this stuff because we've lived through it from when we first stepped into the behavior world, and we had to be apologetic about using those kind of words, and we always felt guilty because we didn't have the research to go back and say, look, here's the evidence for it.
But maybe this is the change then, because I'm guessing the reason that these words can be used more freely within academia is because the body of evidence was pushing through. You can deny all that all you like. I think denial is a good word here, because if we were to really think about well-being and the emotional experience of the individual animal, that poses a huge challenge to farming, actually now.
It does. Oh, yes.
Challenge to even keeping an animal as a pet, for want of a better word. And I think
yeah, it does. It's really complicated.
It is complicated, and I think this is why these kind of conversations are important, and that's the nature of this conference, really, and to look at multiple species, because before and traditionally we have conferences based on a species, or we have a conference based on a specific area, maybe pain within veterinary or something. But to think about emotional well-being and what does that mean, and look at all these species. On this conference we've got horses, cats, dogs, reptiles. Understanding the rich social and emotional lives of reptiles. It invites people to start thinking, okay, what does this mean? How do we do better with this kind of information? And also, you mentioned there about the experiments with Albert there. This notion that, especially this notion of conditioned emotional responses, for me, that somehow this notion that we have the power to make another feel or not feel something is something that we're all questioning now, about how ethical is that even, the harm that can be done in that process, because invariably there'll be other things happening as well as what we see as regards the behavioral output and results. Sarah?
Yes, I'm just going to touch on something that you mentioned as well. It is as well recognizing that with increased knowledge and awareness, comes increased responsibility. And that is a huge thing for people to start to navigate. And if we keep our focus on what we see and managing and modifying the behavior and the being in front of us, it actually sort of absolves us of the responsibility of thinking what we might need to change or modify in our own behavior, our own lifestyle, the environment in which we've chosen to bring that animal, what access does that animal have to other meaningful beings in their life. You know, we can sort of divorce ourselves of that responsibility if we stay blinkered to the emotional well-being of our animal companions. And so many aspects of our life have we've been taught to ignore all those interoceptive system signals in our own body. And I think we do it inadvertently to our animal companions as well. And that obviously includes horses, you know, any being that we've invited into our space. And when I was a child, my father would constantly say, you chose to bring that animal into your life. That animal didn't choose to come and live with you. So it's your responsibility to do, you know, right by that animal. But even then, with husbandry, with rabbits and guinea pigs, the knowledge was so poor. You know, things that were acceptable and even considered an improvement for well-being 20, 30 years ago were, you know, are woefully inadequate now. So knowledge is great, but with knowledge does come more responsibility, and not everyone can take that on board. They don't have the capacity, the bandwidth, can't maybe start exploring other things in their life that they might need to consider. It's huge.
It is huge. It's such an important point. And of course, my conversation with Sindor in the conference really touched upon a lot of the aspect of us and our own journeys and our own kind of growth through these things. And I think this is the thing about improving awareness of emotional well-being, because tagline is emotional well-being matters, because it does for us. And I think the hope is that as people understand some of this and strip back some of the layers of our own conditioning, that actually frees us a little bit, as well as that responsibility you talk about, Sarah. The other side of that is it gives us the opportunity to become more aware of the animals that we share our lives with. And we as individuals then can make those choices about how we turn up for those animals. Daniel.
Yeah, I just think I wanted to pick up on something obviously you said as well there, Sarah, in terms of we are getting more and more knowledge in terms of how animals behave and what might impact welfare and well-being. And I think one of the things to be careful of that as well is that's on a population level, or much of it is at a population level. So, for example, biological research is looking more and more into like which hormones are involved in particular emotions, which neurotransmitters are involved in particular emotions, and that's leading to a couple of things really. So one, a lot of misunderstandings about what they do and how different neurochemicals work and contribute to emotions. And I think that can lead to, again, people wanting to kind of oversimplify what they're seeing in their individual animal. Oh, this animal, you know, because he wants to do this, his dopamine levels are high and he's having a great time. Actually, just because an animal's wanting to do something and wanting to engage in a behavior, it doesn't necessarily tell us that that's the right thing for that animal to be doing. And secondly, I think just because we know that there are certain kind of trends in terms of the data, in terms of what might be good welfare for an animal, or what might be helpful for an animal's emotional well-being, I think we still have to look at that in that individual animal and try and understand based on what we're seeing in them, based on how they're responding to things, what they like, what well-being means for them, because of course that's going to be so different for the individual based on all their different experiences, based on their genetics and everything that influences their individual nature.
Yeah, and I mean this is that's a really good point. I think this is something else as well. One of the things that's going to come away from this conference, I think, with all the wonderful presentations and different species, is once we have that level of awareness, it helps us to turn up better, I think, to that individual animal, because we understand some of the things, the key points that we need for our own emotional well-being. Actually, I think I can't remember who it was who said this now, but you know, that we're all kind of the same really with our needs, other than species specific needs that might be very specific for that species, and species specific ways to communicate need. after that, everything else is pretty well the same. You know, the need for safety, the need for food, the need for comfort, the need for social connections, all these kind of aspects, you know. Kate.
Where to go? There's been a few things that have popped into my head, but just to rewind a little bit to something that Robert was talking about with regards to trauma and PTSD, and the fact that that wasn't kind of recognized until quite late, even in humans. And then linking into something Daniel just said about individuality. And I think that when we think trauma, I'm saying we as a global kind of perception, may think things like war zones, which obviously is the case. But because trauma is so individual, we may not consider things that go missed by us, that actually an individual has experienced that was very traumatic for them, which they may have internalized or may not have been seen. I just don't think that we recognize that enough. I mean, for an example, in the horse world, is moving home is potentially very, very traumatic, and it happens a lot of times within the average horse's life. But I don't think that that's appreciated as much as it should be. But that's just one of many examples.
Well, and the way you define trauma is a response. It has nothing to do with the inherent qualities of the experience, because two subjects could go through the same experience. One is stressed but recovers and is able to live their life, whether they're human, non-human. And the other is traumatized because that experience has overwhelmed their capacity to cope. And that's why I think one of the most important things we can do is really stress the animal-human bond as a listening partnership. I call it interspecies cooperation, because unless we're listening, we're not going to hear that response. And you can't, I totally agree with you, Kate. You cannot assume that this experience is, it sounds devastating, so therefore it's traumatic. We don't get to decide that. It's the person, the dog, the cat the horse in front of us whose response decides that. And they communicate to us that, that's why I think the ability to listen and see our partners, whoever they are, honestly and for who they are, is one of the most healing and important things we can focus on in our work with animals and humans.
That's such a great
Sorry.
well, I was going to say so. So, Joe, this thing about response there, Laura, is really, really important, isn't it? Because a lot of those responses that are trauma responses are often either categorized as being challenging behavior, being listened to, or in the case of horses, Kate, and I know we've spoken before, and you mentioned some of these horses that they could have like 20 homes over the course of their life or more, and they need that stability in that kind of predictable environment and the connections they make. And quite often some of these trauma responses are actually an animal that seems like they're behaving. Actually, they're just shut down now, and they're just complying. And I think this is one of the reasons why understanding emotional well-being and all these topics and trauma, especially, which is your speciality, I know, Laura, is so important when we start thinking about turning up more for our companion animals and having those conversations that Laura's talking about.
And as Laura was saying, it's so important to listen and observe and slow down. Stand back, watch more, do less is something that I share a lot through ACE, because we also have to recognize if we may fall under the label of reward-based training, you can suppress and cause trauma through reward-based training. And that's why I also differentiate between reward-based based training and rewarding education, because the two are very different, because it's about that lived experience of the animal, not the person who perceives the interaction to be rewarding because they're adding in treats. And I remember in 2008 when Cookie Dough Dynamo came to me, an amazing dog who completely changed the way I connect with animals. And I thought I had taught her some really good coping skills around their stimulation of their sort of Hoover being in her space. It was noisy and it moved and very arousing for her. And it was only when I actually stopped and watched her and saw that, yes, she was still, she was watching. She wasn't frozen, but she wasn't relaxed and soft in the body. And actually, her blink rate was really, really rapid, that I realized that I hadn't actually helped her feel differently about that experience. I'd just given her maybe some coping skills at best. So we can still expose our animals to trauma, but not recognize those small details and those little threads that weave together to create the more enriched tapestry that shares far more of the story of that animal than we might ever notice, because we may be so task focused. And for me, it isn't about outcomes, it's about income for that animal. And it's an amazing adventure. The more I see, the more I can't believe how much we've missed. And I can't wait to see what we're still missing now, because there's going to be so much information that is just sort of passing us by.
And there'll be a lot of things that are unique to that animal as well. That's the beautiful thing about doing those observations. I love your question mark, Sarah, that you talk in relation to those observations and think, oh, that's the fourth time, that's the fifth time, that's the sixth time I've seen it from this animal, regardless of what we're supposed to believe these animals are supposed to do. This animal, this individual animal, keeps doing it in that particular situation. Robert, did you want to come in on? No?
So very, very briefly, I wanted to just capture everything that's been said by Sarah, Daniel, Kate, and Laura in a couple of words that basically every animal caregiver can take away with them, be it dog, cat, lizard, rabbit, whatever kind of pet you have at home when you take all this back with you. And the two words are control. An animal needs control, which basically means agency. They're able to move away from a busy room. If you've got loads of kids come to your house and there's a lot of noise around, loud TV, the door needs to be open so the animal can move away and go and find somewhere quieter. And most importantly, they need predictability. Unpredictable lives are very traumatic lives. And the thing is, we expect particularly companion dogs, not so much cats, because cats often just go off and do their own thing anyway. They can jump over stair gates and run upstairs and hide under beds. Dogs don't have that kind of agency. And so it's really, really important if you live in a busy household, which most of us humans do, with lots of stuff going, kids coming and going, stresses and strains of having to go to work on Monday morning and pay the bills, all of that unpredictability that you have as the caregiver gets rubbed off on your dog or your cat or the other companion animals in your household. That is really, really important. Control, the animal needs control, the animal needs predictability. Those two things, if you have those, that makes you resilient to trauma. So, I'm sure Sarah and Laura would testify on that from the animals that they see. It's that lack of control and predictability which makes one much more vulnerable to then suffer from the negative consequences of traumatic experiences. A traumatic experience in life does not always lead to trauma. It's a very small percentage of animals and people, it's about 3 to 5%, that actually develop trauma which is long-standing and persists and very difficult to treat. So, but it's really easy for a caregiver to insulate their animals, to vaccinate their animals against those sort of things. And as Daniel says, there's a lot of individual variation in animals. It depends on the kind of animal you've got, their upbringing, their puppyhood, which you haven't mentioned at all, their early life experiences, the experiences of the mother, etc., which also play a huge part in all of this as well. And it's the same with horses. I've worked in the horse world as well, Kate, and I've seen this particularly with the welfare issues of horses, etc. I walked away from horse veterinary medicine because I just couldn't stand the people. I loved the animals, I hated the people. And I just got traumatized by those people. So I moved away and got out of it, and farm animal work as well. So anyway, that's my kind of summing up of what you've all said so far.
Right. Thank you, Robert. Daniel, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, I just want to build on that as well, because I think one thing to think about with predictability is, I think, particularly when we're thinking about perhaps the kind of more traditional training, the more very sort of ABA style training, is if we're working with a caregiver that perhaps hasn't done a lot of training, perhaps isn't like that normally with their dog, and then suddenly we're saying, okay, your dog's really struggling in this situation, or your animal's really struggling in this situation, and then we start getting that person to behave in a way that they've never behaved before with their animal, suddenly staying really still, suddenly they're not talking to them, suddenly they're only giving food reinforcers, suddenly, everything's really different. They're like, oh, hang on, let me just, extinguish that quickly while we're waiting for the animal to behave, do the behavior we want. I think that is one of the biggest sources of unpredictability in the social environment that animal's ever going to get. And of course, the social environment is a super important place to have that sense of predictability, because, you can have a varied routine, you can have sort of a slightly more chaotic life. But I think one thing that we really want to be thinking about predictability for when we're thinking about social animals is actually predictability in terms of consistency in the interactions that they get with you, and knowing what they're getting when they turn to you, when they engage with you and look to you for support.
And that's what I would call, I talk a lot about trauma, but honestly, you could generalize this to all interspecies relationships. To me, I would change the word predictability a bit and call it deep safety. This visceral inner sense of deep safety. The world is safe. If I turn to my human, I know what I'm getting, and I feel safe about doing that. I feel safe about going outside. That comes from within the subject, right? I love predictability, and I agree. I totally agree with you. I just think I would change it into a language of emotional well-being, which comes from within us, rather than uh, something that probably most of us would measure from the outside and assess from the outside. So, alongside predictability, I would like to put deep safety, visceral experience of, the world is safe, basically. Doesn't mean stress doesn't happen, but I don't, I just finished working with a dog who didn't want to go outside the toilet because outside was too dangerous. That's what I'm talking about. Deep safety.
Thank you, Laura. Well, I had the joy of being invited to be on a panel podcast recently, which had different disciplines from different areas, including social workers and some people from some child psychologists. And the conversation there was like the conversation we've had here. This is what's so interesting. A lot of the language we're using, a lot of the way that we're framing things truly is applicable across species. And a lot of these conversations have been had within, especially within the kind of progressive side of child educational psychology and development in the last 20 or so years, about how we shift away from quite a kind of an arbitrary way of looking at child support and having that more child-centered approach. And we're looking at more of an animal-centered approach and thinking about emotional being. So as we close up, then I just want to go just around the kind of virtual space here, and so we think about that little saying then that we've kind of had for the conference, emotional well-being matters. So I want to ask you, as I come round, for you as individuals, emotional well-being matters. Why? Because for you, emotional well-being matters. Sarah, could we start with you?
Oh gosh, it matters. I think it comes back to what Laura was saying, for that sense of contentment, that sense of safety, and that adaptability. I think maybe we should be looking at, talking about adaptability alongside resilience. You are able to adapt to and process every life experience that you are likely to experience, rather than shake it off and carry on, if that makes sense, because that is sometimes what people perceive resilience to be. You are going to be okay regardless. And obviously it isn't that, it's much deeper than that. So yeah, I think emotional well-being matters because it's the core of how you live your life and respond to everything that happens in that life.
That's brilliant. And I love that framing when we think about, there is a difference between the notion of being resilient and the individual's ability to have resilience. I think that's a really good thing there. Daniel.
I suppose really simply, I think because I know that emotional well-being matters for me, and I want to live a life where I feel, I have emotional well-being and I have the opportunity to feel happy, I would want to afford that to the animals that I live with and interact with as well.
I love that. I love that. Kate.
Sorry, my mouse went to sleep. I think maybe looking at it from almost like a cycle point of view in terms of quality of life and physical health and the effects of a negative emotional well-being, what that has on your physical health, which then comes back to your emotional well-being, because we know that bad physical health, pain, affects that. So a bit of a cycle, but taking into account that most, if not all, of the species that we talk about are social species, and how we are experiencing our own emotions then has a knock-on effect to those around us, and then back again to us, I guess. So I think it's just general quality of life, and it's kind of fundamental to that, I would say.
Yeah, I love that, because if you think about feelings, that can be physical feelings, emotional feelings, all these kind of things, and it gives us an idea of how we're coping or not. But also know a lot of those emotional responses are there to communicate to others the same. And I think so emotional well-being has a element of contagion to it, I think, as well. I think for all of us around us. Laura.
Well, to add to the wonderful responses of everyone else, so one thing is I love my animals. I love them. And my vision of the human animal bond is a partnership. It's a partnership. And I know in my human relationships, I want to be seen and heard for who I really am.
Mm.
And that's what I need to bring to my partners, whatever species they are. And that means I change what I do in relation to what I'm hearing from them. And emotional well-being is so much a part of being a good partner. And that kind of interspecies cooperation. So I think if you love your animals, emotional well-being of your partner, your family member, has got to be at the top of your agenda.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you, Laura. And finally, Robert.
Right. Well, I was lucky enough to kind of give the inaugural talk, if you like, on this, which was all about well-being and happiness. But I can sum it up in 4 words: A, life, worth, living. And just to add to that very, very briefly, most of the caregivers who will be or will have watched this conference will be one species people. They'll tend to have a dog or a cat, or maybe a dog and cat. If they've got kids, they might have a guinea pig or a rabbit or a gerbil or something. And we tend not to think outside our species, if that makes sense. So if you're a dog person, you tend not to think beyond dogs. I implore everybody to think about multiple species. Just spend a little bit of time exploring the rich emotional lives of other animals. not just mammals such as mice, rats, and so on, but also other animals as well, such as reptiles, tortoises. The rich species that you'll see, some people that you think are quite strange in the kind of animals they keep, but there's an awful lot to be learned there. And I think it kind of broadens one horizons about thinking about our preferred species that we've chosen to live our lives with. And I think that then sums up the true spirit of what this conference is about. But it's about Pet Remedy, which are a multi-species organization, and the conference is a multi-species organization. So it was just a kind of reminder that if you're a one species person, do remember that there are other species that also matter and need to have a life worth living as well.
Oh, thank you. A life worth living. I think that's a great place to finish. And I just want to thank you all for joining me for this panel discussion and for your wonderful contributions to the conference with your amazing presentations. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.